Fog clung low over range echo, thick enough that the fast steel plates at the 2,000-meter berm came and went like ghosts, yet thin enough that the crowd on the catwalk above the firing line could see the men on their bellies and feel the weight of their own eyes on them. So the whole place hummed with a tight showtime energy as the SEALs settled in behind their rifles and the digital red timer over range control kicked from 90:00 down to 89:59 because this wasn't just another practice shoot. This was the last long-range cool window before deployment, and everyone knew it. Lieutenant Harlan stood at the front of the catwalk in a ball cap with his name strip velcroed across the front, chest turned slightly toward the watchers because he understood how to perform rank as well as how to call wind, barking corrections down at the shooters while junior sailors, range techs, and a couple of visiting officers leaned on the rail behind him, murmuring about the mission they weren't cleared to hear the details of and pretending not to notice the way he stole glances at them to make sure they were noticing him. When the lone figure appeared at the edge of the concrete, it was easy for everyone to see she didn't belong, because she stepped out of the fog not in fragmentan and green but in plain range clothes, clean but unremarkable, a ball cap without unit logo pulled low over dark hair, a scuffed rifle case in one hand and a folded sheet of paper in the other, and she stopped by the yellow line as if careful not to step an inch past what she'd been told, which made it even easier for the men already in place to decide she was some kind of mistake. Heads turned along the line because the firing had paused for Harlan's pre-brief, and since everyone had a few seconds with nothing to do but watch, they watched her, taking in the way she stood, the way she kept her eyes on the catwalk instead of on them, the way she held the paper like it meant more than she did, and already the first quiet snorts of laughter were moving through the crowd before she even opened her mouth, because the power imbalance was that obvious. She lifted the authorization letter in a small, controlled motion that felt like she'd rehearsed it, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted to get this right the first time. And she called up toward the catwalk, voice clear but not loud, asking for the training officer by position rather than by name, which made Harlan smile in that tight way of someone who feels his status being fed. So he cut his own briefing sentence in half, raised one hand to quiet his shooters, and leaned on the rail so everyone could hear him ask who let the civilian tourist wander into his range block. A few people laughed out loud because he'd given them permission to, and when she said she had orders authorizing her presence on range echo during this qualifying window, he waved a hand in an exaggerated, "I don't need to see your ticket" motion that drew more chuckles, then told her whatever PowerPoint she was supposed to show could wait until after the men with rifles were done doing the real work. She tried again, saying the paper was signed by a flag officer, and stepped forward one small pace, still not over the safety line. And that choice, to obey the line even as he mocked her, gave him exactly what he needed, because he reached down, plucked the letter from her hand as if indulging a child, and with his other hand grabbed the corner of her rifle case, pivoting it outward so everyone on the catwalk could see the small black patch sewn near the handle. It was no bigger than his thumb, a coiled silver snake inside a set of narrow crosshairs with a number 13 stitched faintly beneath, and to the men who didn't recognize it, which was nearly all of them, it looked like the kind of edgy kit you bought off some tactical website to make yourself feel like part of something harder than you were. So when Harlan turned it toward the crowd and said, "Check it out, guys, we've got Instagram sniper merch on deck," the laugh landed, cameras came up, and one of the younger SEALs snapped a perfect, zoomed-in shot of the patch for the troop chat. Because no one in real authority corrected him yet, that mockery hardened on impact and became the official read of what she was. An oddity with a try-hard patch and a piece of paper nobody up top cared about as much as they cared about the lieutenant's call schedule, which meant she ended up standing alone at the edge of the line with her hand empty, her authorization crumpled in Harlan's fist, the timer ticking down behind her, and a row of men with rifles and rank laughing toward her, while the question that nobody but the audience fully felt yet, what do they not know about her, slid into place under the noise and began to quietly burn. Harlan stuffed the paper into his pocket without unfolding it because admitting he had to check it would have meant admitting she might have equal standing with his plan, and he turned back toward his shooters with a breezy, "All right, gents, let's get this done before the Admiral swings through and asks why you can't hit anything past a football field, which kept everyone's focus on the mission and not on the way he'd casually erased someone else's orders. So the first SEAL dropped into, prone on lane 1, wrapped his hand around the pistol grip, and pressed his cheek to the stock while the rest of the line adjusted bipods and checked dope. The timer flicked from 87:00 to 86:59, and the woman stepped back to the side rail without a word, listening as Harlan called out wind and distance and shot cadence, her eyes not on him but on the range itself, sliding from flag to flag, from mirage to steel, as if she were cataloging something. Yet she made no move to interrupt, which meant the only story the crowd had to work with was the one he'd given them. As the first shooter fired and the report of the rifle rolled up the concrete like thunder, ringing steel at the nearer plate and missing the subtle misalignment on a farther stand that only someone who'd been staring at angles instead of faces would notice, she watched the dirt splash under the target and saw that it wasn't the shooter at fault but the weld on the plate. Yet when a range tech jogged by, she only murmured a quiet note about the mount and let him shrug it off, because she'd already made the choice that she wasn't going to fight for attention here. She was going to wait for the system that had sent her to recognize its own orders. After the first string, when brass lay scattered on the concrete and the fog shifted just enough to reveal the far gongs again, she stepped forward once more and asked to speak to the training officer, this time holding out her hand in a gesture that could have been asking for the paperback, but was really an attempt to bring the conversation down off the catwalk and onto the one place where she still had leverage, the printed orders. Harlan turned halfway around as if she were an interruption rather than part of the plan, and that tiny show of annoyance rippled through the men behind him because if the lieutenant didn't respect her, why should they? So when she said she'd been sent to record and verify long-range ballistic data for their mission profile, which meant she needed to be on the firing line, beside their spotters, actually reading what the wind was doing at range instead of from behind glass, his jaw tipped in incredulity. Instead of considering the request, he smirked and asked if she'd ever handled a .300 Win Mag outside of PowerPoint, and when she didn't rise to the bait, didn't mention any training history or past call signs, just repeated that her orders placed her on the line. He rolled his eyes and told her she could sit on the safe side, behind the glass with the other brief writers, which drew a sharper, more comfortable laugh from the younger shooters who were grateful to have a social target that wasn't them. Because she didn't push, didn't let her pride flare and demand respect at the volume they were used to hearing. They took her quiet as weakness, and within a few exchanges she had become Spreadsheet and Viper Bobby, nicknames tossed back and forth between lanes as if the patch had earned her parody rather than caution. So some of the men took stealth photos from the corners of their phones, capturing her standing there with that little cold snake emblem on the case, filing them straight into the troop group chat with captions about range maskets. The more she stayed composed, the more confident they became in their misreading. Because if she had anything real to back that patch, surely she'd flaunt it, surely she'd bark back, surely she'd make them feel it. And since she didn't, their certainty that they were punching down safely grew, which is how reputational damage snowballed. Not because anyone decided to be cruel in a vacuum, but because an institutionally empowered man modeled it and the group followed, grateful to have someone outside their own ranks to cut. She accepted the offered folding chair behind the side glass only long enough to set her laptop case beside it, then stepped away from the fake comfort of being seated and moved to stand by the big range window, tablet in hand, watching the wind through tempered glass instead of breathable air because that was the only position she'd been given. Yet she still began recording numbers, muzzle velocities called out from chrono screens, impact patterns she could see through spotting scopes that operators weren't adjusting to match. Notes about the way the new ammo lot was printing slightly low and left at the far berm once the fog thinned enough to show it. The range tech who'd shrugged her off about the misaligned plate flinched when the first shooter's round kissed steel but took a bite out of the stand, spraying paint and dirt, and when he glanced up he caught her watching him through the pane. No accusation in her face, only a quiet confirmation that she'd seen it coming, which made him swallow because it forced him to recognize she was seeing things he wasn't, but institutional gravity leaned him back toward silence. So he muttered something about welders and walked on, leaving the imbalance unchecked. When Harlan's phone buzzed against his plate carrier and he glanced down, the muscles in his neck tightened, because the message from range control mentioned the Admiral's escort pushing through the gate and adjusting schedule, which meant the visiting flag might drop by earlier than expected. So he turned to the line and raised his voice, telling everyone they had 1 hour, gentlemen, 1 hour to prove we are not flying blind tomorrow night, which snapped the time pressure into focus, not just for the shooters, but for anyone who understood that missing this data window meant the mission would either go ahead with guesswork or get weighed down in bureaucracy. The digital timer hit 60:00 with a small beep that somehow cut through the gunfire. And in that moment, with the clock now clearly tied to consequences, his impatience with anyone who wasn't a shooter calcified. So when the woman asked again for access to the line, not louder, just firmer, he told her she could stay as long as you don't touch anything, effectively freezing her out while granting himself the satisfaction of magnanimity in front of witnesses. As more shooters cycled through and the wind in the valley did what wind always did, shifted just enough to make anyone who was half paying attention look foolish. Misses at the extended distances began to stack up, turning the fog-shrouded plates into a kind of silent jury, because each dull thud a bullet into dirt instead of steel chipped away at the unspoken belief that the SEALs could brute force their way past conditions. So tension on the line crept up. The woman kept logging data, tracking the spread, noting how a 0.2 mil adjustment here and a corrected wind call there would close the gap, yet still no one invited her closer, and the more the misses mounted, the more the shooter's frustration turned outward, looking for somewhere safer than a mirror to land. It was Ramirez, tall, tanned, and swaggering in a way that got laughs in bars and grudging respect on obstacle courses, who saw that the crowd was itching for a release valve. So he slung his rifle over his shoulder between strings and turned toward the back glass, sweeping an exaggerated boho way as he called out that it was only fair to give Viper Barbie a turn. He made it a joke first because jokes were safer than direct challenges, saying they could trim 15 minutes off the schedule if they let the patch model go prone and show them how it was done at a mere 900. And since Harlan had just looked at the timer and seen 40:00 slip into 39:59, he decided letting the sideshow play out might buy him some goodwill from the crowd without really costing time. So he nodded and called down that if their visitor wanted range access, this was her chance. The invitation was a trap disguised as inclusion, and everyone knew it, because if she refused, she was admitting fear in front of a packed catwalk, and if she accepted and missed, the story of her failure would travel with the same speed as every group chat image of that patch. Yet when she said she wasn't here to shoot, only to collect data and keep them from flying blind, Ramirez leaned in on the open MIC and announced that she was scared of steel, and that anyone who had to wear a snake in Crosshay's patch to feel tough probably couldn't hit a barn door from 50 yards anyway. The laughter this time had an edge to it because it came not just from mocking her, but from defending their sense of themselves as the only ones who belonged, and phones were already up again, capturing the little tableau for later retelling. Harlan saw an opportunity to reassert the difference between the people with rifles and the person with a tablet, so he layered institutional weight onto Ramirez's showmanship by telling her, within earshot of every microphone and every rank insignia, that if she couldn't demonstrate basic safety and competence with the weapons on his line, he would have to recommend revoking her range clearance across the training complex, which meant she wouldn't just be locked out of this call block, she'd be locked out of future ones as well. He wrapped it in the language of safety, talking about liability, because that word had power in range control reports, yet beneath it was a simple threat: play our game our way or lose your ability to do your job. Ramirez stepped closer then and tapped the little patch with one finger. The physical touch almost casual but loaded because he did it in the middle of live-fire operations, saying patch first, skills later, right? While the gunfire from other lanes continued in the background. And that echo, the symbol mocked now under higher stakes, in the jaws of real hazard and a shrinking clock rather than at the looser start of the day, dug the misread deeper into the fabric of the scene. She still didn't snap. Instead, she moved toward the edge of the firing position where another SEAL was settling behind the rifle, and she did something that made no sense to anyone who believed she was just a spreadsheet jockey. She read the air in one sweep, checked the position of the nearest flag, the shimmer in the mirage over the berm, the way the fog was thinning in uneven curls, and gave the shooter a quiet, precise wind call, offering the adjustment as if she'd done that 1,000 times before, then stepped back without waiting to see if he'd take it. He didn't, because taking it would have meant trusting her more than his own ego. So he sent the round with the hold he'd picked, and it splashed dust edge-low on the plate instead of ringing center, earning him a muttered curse and nothing more. But the range tech who'd already registered her earlier warning felt his throat tighten, because for the second time she had seen exactly what was coming and the men with nominal control had ignored her. He looked up toward the catwalk, saw Harlan laughing with the sailors, saw Ramirez mugging for the phone cameras, and the institutional pressure that said, "Do not contradict the training officer in public unless you want your next evil to sting," pushed him back into his lane, leaving her standing with only her notes and her restraint. The first real support she might have had evaporated a few minutes later when the logistics major who had actually routed her tasking, one of the few people on base who'd read the full email thread and understood why a ballistic specialist had been attached to this call, took a phone call from operations, frowned, and hurried off the catwalk in the direction of the admin buildings, giving her a brief, apologetic look as he went that said, "I see you, but I can't stay." That departure was more than a single man leaving. It yanked away the only potential buffer between her and Harlan's narrative, because without an officer of equal or higher stripe willing to vouch for her orders in that moment, she became, in every practical sense, a guest on his range at his sufferance, which meant setback one arrived not with a gunshot but with the soft slap of a door closing behind someone who might have spoken up. The timer dropped to 30:00, the tone that marked the last third of the block chimed, and Harlan, feeling the weight of that number, started cutting safety pauses short, waving shooters into position faster, overlapping comms, and telling range control they'd clear paperwork later because he wanted rounds downrange now, which meant tension on the line spiked in a different way as people rushed what should not be rushed. That was why, when one shooter came off the previous string aggravated by his own misses and hustled back onto the concrete with adrenaline still running hot, he slapped a magazine into his rifle and swung the barrel in a careless arc that tracked briefly across a space it should never have crossed, the side area where she happened to be standing. He didn't mean to. He was just moving too fast because his lieutenant had made clear that time mattered more than process, but intent didn't change the geometry of danger. And the woman stepped in on reflex, one hand snapping out to grab the barrel and redirect it back toward the berm, while her other hand pushed gently at his shoulder to halt his forward motion. Her voice low but firm as she told him not to sweep the glass. The muzzle never rose above the safety line because she had caught it. Yet to anyone watching from the catwalk without context, the image was stark, an unauthorized body putting hands on a live weapon mid-range. Harlan seized on that, because it gave him procedural cover for what his pride already wanted to do. So he called a ceasefire on that lane, pointed down at her in front of everyone, and said she had just touched a live weapon without authorization, and that he'd be putting it into the range log as an incident. By letting her instinct for safety stay stronger than any desire to explain herself, she had given him the official reason he needed to escalate from mockery to punishment, and now the situation was too hot to simply cool down. Any next step would have paper trails and career consequences attached. The fog thickened at the far berm again as if to match it, swallowing the hint of steel, and shooters grounded their rifles while they waited to see what would happen to the stranger who had dared to reach into their world. Harlan walked down off the catwalk then, boots ringing on the metal steps, his jaw tight not just because of what she'd done but because he could feel the clock chewing through the last 20-odd minutes of his call window, and rather than spread that stress across the institutional delays and weather complications that had eaten his morning, he funneled it into the most convenient target. The physical scene had grown more claustrophobic without anyone moving much. Rifles on bipeds, men standing behind them, glass wall holding sailors and techs, concrete bay, fog beyond, and her in the middle of that lead box. So when he reached her and stopped close enough that she could smell cordite and coffee on his breath, the circle felt complete in a way that left very little room to breathe. He raised his voice not to match the noise level, because the line was actually quiet now, but to make sure everyone above could hear him say that she had interfered with range operations and violated safety protocol by grabbing a weapon, which, he reminded them, was grounds for removal. When she answered, she kept her tone measured, saying the muzzle had crossed a danger sector and she had corrected it, which any qualified range officer would do, and she would be happy to log her statement alongside his. That offer to share the record rather than submit to being written about only enraged him further because it implied equality. So he made the next choice that would push events past recovery. He declared, loudly enough for range control's open mics to pick up, that her authorization was invalid, that her presence was unauthorized, and that as training officer he was revoking her access to range echo effective immediately. The words themselves were just there, but he anchored them with action, reaching into his pocket, yanking out the folded, damp paper she had brought, tearing it cleanly in half in front of her, then letting the pieces fall into a shallow puddle pooled in a crack in the concrete at her feet. To the shooters and sailors and junior officers watching, that act stamped his decision as final and non-negotiable, because tearing paper that bore a highest signature felt symbolic of overriding it, and they had been conditioned to accept that the man closest to the danger with the most local power set the rules. Two base military police officers, who had been present more as a formality near the range gate, saw him point toward her and crooked his fingers, so they stepped onto the line, hands resting near but not on the batons at their belts, and took up positions on either side of her with the practiced neutrality of people who had walked a lot of people off a lot of spaces without ever needing to know the full story. Holland pulled out his phone and, still speaking loudly, dictated a brief incident note into a range control app, using phrases like safety interference and unauthorized contact, framing the story the way he wanted it preserved, and the procedural weight of his title meant that, unless someone else intervened with equal authority, that would become the official version. Somewhere in the background, a range tech who had had enough of the cognitive dissonance between what he'd seen her call correctly and the way she was being treated tapped out a quick message on his own handheld to the one person he thought might care, the Command Master Chief, responsible for training standards across the group. He didn't embellish. He just wrote that the training officer had just bounced an authorized ballistics observer from the call and torn up a signed order, adding that the clock was at 3 p.m. and the Admiral was inbound, which meant any mess created here would be very hard to hide by the time the flag reached the catwalk. He hit send because the combination of social abuse, institutional overreach, and procedural distortion finally outweighed his fear of rocking the boat. In that same moment, as the MPs began to gently angle her toward the edge of the line, the corner of the little black patch on her rifle case snagged on the rough fabric of one MP's glove and peeled up a millimeter, exposing, for anyone close enough and old enough to recognize it, a smaller, faded unit tab stitched underneath, its letters barely visible but still readable if you'd ever seen them before. Meridian. One of the older SEAL chiefs on the line, who had done enough time in enough places to have heard the word Meridian spoken in whispers about operations that never made it into after-action reports, saw that sliver of old thread and felt his stomach drop. Because while he didn't know the full story, he knew that tab did not come from a website, and realizing that collided hard with the image of her standing between two MPs with torn orders at her feet. He didn't shout anything. Decades of training kept his face impassive and his mouth shut, but his eyes tracked her as she was guided away, and that silent recognition became another pressure point pushing against the lie Holland had just made official. Outside the bay, a car door slammed, and the Master Chief, walking up from admin toward the range with a Rear Admiral's improvised tour schedule in his head, felt his pocket buzz with the range text message just as he heard Holland's raised voice echo out from the concrete. He changed direction a few degrees without breaking stride because the combination of words in the text, bounced, authorized, tore up order, were not ones he could ignore. And when he stepped through the door to the catwalk and looked down, he saw MPs, a woman with a rifle case and a patch he hadn't seen in years, and a training officer standing over torn paper in a puddle, and that sight forced his hand in a way that had nothing to do with chance. The digital timer over range control flashed 3 p.m. and beeped, a small sound but sharp in the sudden quiet that fell when a new voice, older, roughened by years rather than volume, came over the range loudspeaker, calling a hard ceasefire across all lanes. Shooters froze, fingers coming off triggers, bolts lifted, actions cleared because you didn't ignore that tone, and the chat on the catwalk died mid-sentence as every head turned toward the Master Chief, who had taken the microphone with the ease of someone who owned this air when he needed it. He ordered all weapons grounded and all personnel to remain in place until the situation was clarified, which in one sentence stripped Harlan of the control he'd been using the whole morning to hold the narrative together. Rifles lay silent on the concrete, bolts open, magazines out, brass cooling in neat little piles, while the fog at the far berm sat heavy and still. And in that pause, with nothing moving but the red seconds ticking down on the clock and the slow walk of the Master Chief along the catwalk, power shifted levels in a way everyone on the range could feel. He didn't address Harlan first. Instead, he came to a stop above the MPs and the woman they flanked and looked at her face, really looked, not to find weakness but to find recognition, and then let his gaze drop to the rifle case, to the slightly peeled patch and the glimpse of meridian beneath. Something in his expression changed in a way only those who knew him well would catch, a tightening around the eyes, a straightening of his shoulders, and he asked, in a low voice that still carried, for her name. She hesitated only long enough to weigh whether speaking it here would complicate any of the clearances she lived under, then gave it anyway, because the real danger at this moment wasn't secrecy, it was the lie in the log. Chief Petty Officer Maya Ellis, Master Chief. Temporary duty assignment to training group. The chief landed first. A few sailors who had assumed she was a civilian analyst blinked, recalibrating her place in the hierarchy, and Harlan went very still because he had just heard himself demote a chief in front of his own shooters without having known it. Instead of turning that acknowledgement into a public rebuke of Harlan right away, the Master Chief used it to set the ground truth. He told the MPs to step back and thank them for following the call as given, then said, for the log in the ears of everyone present, that Chief Ellis was to remain on the range until he said otherwise. Only then did he look at Harlan and ask, in a horribly calm voice, who had authorized tearing up orders signed by a flag officer. Harlan opened his mouth, tried to launch into a rapid-fire explanation about safety violations and unauthorized contact with weapons, about protecting the Admiral from seeing a mess on the line. But the Master Chief held up a hand and asked to see the incident entry he'd just made. Harlan fumbled with his phone, handed it over, and as the Master Chief read the note, he reached down into the puddle with his free hand, plucked up the soggy halves of the letter, smoothed them gently against his leg, and held them close enough to his face to read the signature line. The Admiral's name was right where he expected it to be, above a paragraph explicitly assigning Chief Ellis to this range block to record and verify ballistic data for Mission Profile Echo, and, as necessary, to conduct control shots in support of sniper qualification. He read that part aloud, enunciating each word so there was no misunderstanding, then let the paper hang limp from his fingers while he lifted his eyes to the catwalk and the firing line and said, "It appears, Lieutenant, that the only unauthorized thing on this range at this moment is your decision." A murmur ran along the rail, more felt than heard, as people realized in one breath that the story they'd been living inside all morning, that of an overreaching analyst and a patient training officer, had just cracked. The Master Chief didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because institutional power doesn't shout when it's certain. He explained, in the vaguest possible terms that were still honest, that the patch they'd been laughing at was not a piece of online swag but a legacy marker from a disbanded joint program whose long-range work had kept more than one SEAL team alive in places they weren't going to talk about. And that Chief Ellis was not here to waste their time but to keep tomorrow's operation from turning into the kind of cluster that generated memorial plaques instead of debriefs. He did not give them her history, but he gave them enough to understand that the misjudgment they'd indulged in had not been harmless. And then, to make the interpretation more than just words, he turned to Maya and asked, in front of everyone, if she had brought her own rifle. She nodded once, unsnapped the case, and lifted out a weapon that looked unremarkable to untrained eyes but made every serious shooter in the place recognize the wear marks of use rather than display. The bolt was smooth from handling, the paint rubbed thin in the places where hands and gear rubbed 1,000 times. The fog beyond the far berm had rolled in thicker again, half hiding the 1,800-meter plate, and as she walked to an open lane, the one where the knee accident had happened, the line parted for her without anyone needing to be told, because the Master Chief's framing had already rewritten their options. She dropped prone with a familiarity that made the earlier jokes about PowerPoint evaporate, settled behind the rifle, and waited while a SEAL spotter automatically dropped to the mat beside her, glass coming up out of habit. He found the far plate through the haze, saw it ghost in and out of his reticle, and, more to himself than anyone else, muttered, "Targets at 1-800 meters," the same phrase he'd said a dozen times that morning when calling for his own shooters. It hung there between them, the words that had once been a routine call now sounding like an invocation, and she replied only with a small nod, watching the wind, the fog, the mysterious ways the valley moved air. She built her hold not from guesswork but from the numbers she'd been quietly collecting all morning, adjusted for the temperature shift and the way the fog was building a cooler layer at ground level. Then, when everything lined up in her mind and body, she let the shot break. The sound rolled downrange and seemed to vanish into the mist, so for a heartbeat there was nothing, just silence and the memory of her finger pressing the trigger, and then, faint but undeniable, the bell-like ring of steel floated back through the fog. She worked the bolt without flourish and sent another round, this time walking the impact to a neighboring gong they'd struggled with earlier, then a third, mapping the plate line in 3 quick, precise notes that matched the pattern in her notebook almost exactly. She wasn't showing off. She was proving that the data mattered and that, in the hands of someone who had taken the time to read it, this impossible-looking shot was merely hard instead of suicidal. The Master Chief gave a single, satisfied nod, then turned his attention back to Harlan and said, for the benefit of the range log and everyone who had watched this unfold, that Chief Ellis's presence on the line was not only authorized but required if they wanted tomorrow's mission to proceed with the safety margin the Admiral believed he'd already secured. He cited the section of the range regulations that covered revocation of clearance and made it clear that tearing up orders signed by a flag officer, derogating a chief petty officer publicly without cause, and misusing safety language to mask ego bruises was not just bad form. It was a disciplinary matter. He did not humiliate Harlan the way Harlan had humiliated her. He stated, in that same level tone, that the lieutenant would be relieved of his training officer duties pending review and was to remove himself from the line immediately, leaving his senior chief to manage the remainder of the block. The effect was brutal precisely because it was devoid of theatrics. Where the morning's earlier laughter had been loud and sloppy, this reversal landed like a stamp. Clean, quiet, official. Harlan's face went pale under his tan, and for a heartbeat he looked like he might argue, but the combination of the soggy orders in the Master Chief's hand, the eyes of his shooters on him, and the knowledge that the Admiral was somewhere on the base heading this way forced him into a short nod and a tight-lipped retreat to the edge of the bay, where he stood, suddenly very small, watching the woman he'd written off take his line. With the authority question settled and the clock now at 10 o'clock, the Master Chief used what remained of the block exactly as the orders had intended. He told the sniper troop they would finish their call under Chief Ellis's direction, logging each shot with her adjusted hold so that the data set going into tomorrow's mission brief would be real, not aspirational. The men who had called her names earlier now found themselves prone in front of her, listening to her wind calls and making the small adjustments that turned near misses into satisfying gongs, and while pride made some of them bristle at first, the ringing steel and the growing cluster of impacts around center gave them something harder to argue with than their own reluctance. The range tech who had texted the Master Chief felt the knots in his shoulders loosen as he updated the incident log, changing the entry about unauthorized safety interference into a note about prevented muzzle sweep and appending the Master Chief's own remarks, which meant the paper trail would tell the story a little closer to the truth than it had a few minutes before. Above, on the catwalk, junior sailors swapped looks that said they would be thinking twice before joining in the next pile-on that started with a joke from someone in charge. The Admiral arrived only in time to see the last few minutes of this new order, a chief on the line, SEALs shooting under her guidance, a Master Chief leaning on the rail with his arms folded, and a lieutenant standing very still at the edge of the bay, not invited into the conversation. He asked a few quiet questions, got succinct answers, and, respecting the internal discipline already in motion, did not add a grandstanding speech of his own, because one of the strengths of a good institution is knowing when to trust its own mechanisms. When the timer hit midnight and the final beep sounded, the Master Chief called the block, thanked everyone for their work, and dismissed them to brass pickup and gear stow. There was no applause, no shouted congratulations. The loudest sound was the clatter of empty casings being swept into buckets and the soft rumble of men talking in low voices as they adjusted the news story of who they had almost let themselves be. In the hours that followed, the consequences unfolded mostly behind doors and in side files rather than on loudspeakers. Harlan was formally relieved of his training officer role and reassigned to a desk in a building where his decisions could be watched more closely while an investigation walked through the morning step by step. He wasn't destroyed. The Master Chief believed in correction more than spectacle. But the lesson was carved deep where it needed to be. If you use your slot in the chain to punch down, and you do it by distorting safety rules and ignoring signed orders, the system will, sooner or later, close its hand around you. Ramirez and a few of the other loudest voices were invited to a counseling session that was part conversation, part warning. They lost some of the easy privileges they'd grown fond of, like first pick of range time and the informal status of being the funny ones, and gained, in exchange, a story that would follow them for years under the label "the guys who laughed at the wrong patch," which left its own quiet, jagged mark on their egos. For Maya, the official corrections were less visible but no less real. The incident log was amended to reflect that she had prevented a safety violation, not caused one, and that her presence on the range had been both authorized and crucial to the success of the call. The Master Chief added a note to her file recommending her as a primary instructor for future long-range courses when classification allowed, and in the informal talk that circulates through a community where everyone thinks they know everything, a new thread was woven. Not the full truth of Meridian or Viper 13. Those stayed where they belonged. But the simpler fact that a quiet chief had come to their range, eaten the disrespect of people who should have known better, and still delivered. Exactly what the mission needed without once using her history as a weapon. On the catwalk of Range Echo, someone, no one later admitted to being the one, took the small Viper in crosshairs patch she'd peeled off her case when she was cleaning her gear and stitched it into the corner of the old, wind-frayed range flag that hung over the glass, right where the spotter's eyes always drifted when they were bored between strings. It wasn't an official emblem, and nobody saluted it, but it became a quiet marker that said, "Pay attention. Ask before you judge. Remember the morning we almost got this very wrong." New guys coming through would ask about it, and the story they'd hear would be trimmed of classified detail and personal drama, boiled down to a simple cautionary tale. Don't assume you know what a symbol means just because you're loud enough to laugh at it. A few days later, after briefings and paperwork and 1,000 small tasks that filled the space between training and deployment, the range sat empty again in the late afternoon. Fog burned off and the sky over the valley the washed-out blue of spent adrenaline. The wind had settled into a steady push from the left, predictable and mild, and the steel at 1,800 meters glinted faintly in the sun. On one lane, Chief Ellis lay behind a rifle. Not her own this time, but the weapon of a young SEAL who had struggled the hardest during the call and had, to his quiet shame, been the quickest to share the meme of her patch in the chat. She'd agreed to work with him on her off time. Not because she was obligated, but because the Master Chief had asked, and she had seen something in his eyes when he'd watched her shoot that looked like a desire to be better rather than merely to look good. He was on the mat now, fingers a little too tight on the grip, breathing a little too high in his chest, and she spoke to him in low, steady phrases, talking about the feel of the trigger, the rhythm of his breathing, the way to watch the mirage as if it were a language instead of noise. Behind them, the same men who had laughed the loudest that morning stood in a loose semicircle, plate carries open, helmets under their arms, watching silently because they had chosen to be here rather than being ordered, and there was nothing for them to do but witness. No one had their phone out. The chat had gone quiet on this subject days ago, altered not by threat but by a kind of collective embarrassment. Up on the catwalk, the Master Chief leaned on the rail with his hands behind his back, eyes on the lane, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. The young SEAL broke his shot when she told him to. The rifle bucked gently, and after a heartbeat that seemed to stretch just long enough to hold their breath, the far-off ring of steel came back to them across the valley. He lifted his head, disbelief and relief warring on his face, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind you gave a peer rather than a project. He settled back behind the scope for another attempt without looking back at the crowd because he didn't need their affirmation as much as he needed the feel of the shot he'd just made. On the flag above them, the little black patch caught a thread of evening light and showed its coiled snake in crosshairs for anyone who happened to glance up. No one clapped. No one cheered. The only sounds were the wind moving across the empty lanes, the metallic echo of steel downrange, and the quiet rustle of gear as men who now knew a little more about what they didn't know shifted their weight and watched in respectful silence, each of them carrying away their own version of the same lesson. Sometimes the loudest voice on the range is wrong, and sometimes the person who saves you from that isn't the one shouting but the one who stayed when you gave them every reason to walk.